Okay, then welcome to our capstone of our lecture series. This term, a wonderful lecture series. We had so many great lectures, so many great discussions here, and I'm looking forward. I had a brief sneak peek into the manuscript, so I can assure you that this will be no different today. We do welcome Jennifer Welsh here today, back to Frankfurt, but as I learned, first time here at the university. Jennifer is at the board, advisory board of Prof, Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, and many of us have profited for a long time from her advice and her just kindness in linking us to different people and different experts around the world on one of her topics dear to her heart, responsibility to protect. We have many projects on that at Prof, and we are just grateful that you made it again here. Because she moved, after 20 years in Europe, she moved back to Canada this fall, right?
August,
yeah. So a big change for your life, but it's a longer flight as well to Frankfurt, so we're very grateful that you're here. Jennifer is now Canada 150 research chair in global governance and security, and I thought it might be a mistake, but I just learned Canada is now 150 years old, and they dedicated not 150 chairs, but a tiny amount of research chairs to excellent researchers, and they used it wisely to get you back to Canada. Before, she was at the European University Institute at Florence, at Oxford University. Probably you know many of her writings on R2P, responsibility to protect, on conflict, migration, and geopolitics, and so many big issues. I thought in the very beginning when we invited her that she might go a bit in the direction of one big research project she's currently co-directing, and it's about the individualization of war, reconfiguring the ethics, law, and politics of armed conflict. A wonderful project too, but now she engaged even more impressively with really the topic of our lecture series, the pacification, end of pacification, and the transformation of political violence. So we do appreciate that very much. There were, throughout the lecture series, there were two names often mentioned. One was Pinker. Everyone engaged with Pinker, but almost all of the lectures beforehand said, probably Jennifer will talk about that in the end. Okay. So not to put you in one pocket with Pinker, but it's more an embrace that was there than in Pinker's case it was more an intellectual challenge to his thoughts. Her topic today is pockets of barbarism, internal and external challenges to the international humanitarian order. So we're talking about the 20% Pinker couldn't explain. And we are very much looking forward to your lecture. Welcome to Frankfurt again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. As you know, in 2011, Steven Pinker issued his bold revisionist thesis. Despite the plethora of violent, sensationalist stories in all types of our contemporary media, violence in the human world in nearly every form has declined dramatically. And while his gaze was broad, examining violent practices from genocide to the spanking of children, his analysis of what he calls the new peace, a decline since the end of the Cold War in organized conflict, has been of particular interest to scholars of international relations. In their 2015 article in the Journal of Peace Research, Peterson and Wallenstein seemingly buttress the Pinker thesis by providing added evidence for the well-known claim that interstate war is all but obsolete. If we use the measure of 1,000 battle deaths, they claim there were no interstate wars in 2013, for example, and only 7 civil conflicts. If we lower the threshold to include conflicts with 24 or more battle deaths, there were 33 ongoing conflicts in 2013, of which 24 were civil. According to this analysis, the human costs of war have also apparently declined, although this has increased in recent years due to fighting in Syria and Iraq. Now, as a scholar who's focused for many years on the commission of atrocity crimes, and as a UN official who spent her time looking at the causes and consequences of atrocity crime, I've had a particularly tough time coming to grips with the claims of the better angels of our nature. But I need to consider the possibility that, as with so many of the readers Pinker sets out to convince, my brain has been duped by the human tendency to focus on recent and emotionally salient events rather than long-term trends and cold, hard data. But let me zoom in for a moment on the numbers. I'm not the first to ask whether the empirical claim that violence or war is on the decline is overstated. In her provocative article, Dead Wrong, Tanisha Fazal suggests that while Pinker and others base their arguments on well-established and widely accepted databases, they pay scant attention to the possibility that the primary measure used to count wars, battle deaths, is itself subject to historical pressures that can create a distorted view of the changing incidence of war. So her central claim about the lethality of war is that the number of war deaths might be very different than the number of all war casualties. One might be wounded and not die, especially considering the tremendous advances in military medicine that she documents. In other words, the fact that war has become less fatal doesn't mean it's become less consequential for societies. And for her, this also points to a larger problem with Pinker's work. While he writes about the decline in violence, he never actually defines it. If by violence Pinker means fatalities, then he's correct that violence is on the decline. But as Fazal points out, even a standard dictionary definition of violence would include the attempt or threat to inflict bodily harm. But the critique of Pinker's thesis goes beyond Fazal's demonstration about how war has become less fatal. There's a very lively debate catalyzed by the wildly different estimates of the casualties in the Iraq War as to whether existing methodologies and data availability undercount the direct victims of lethal violence. In addition, the statistical arguments about the decline of war pay almost no attention to the large-scale indirect consequences of conflict and violence, some of which are themselves lethal. As the Stanford pediatrician Paul Wise has powerfully shown, Eddie's study of the impact of armed conflict needs to move beyond a narrow conception of agency, identifiable perpetrators, acts causing immediate harm, and individual victims, to consider how diffuse actions by corporate or collective agents, such as the state or militia, can result in large-scale population displacements or lack of access to basic needs. These actions result in increases in mortality over what would be expected if the conflicts or violence didn't originally occur. So, for example, it's been estimated that in several recent conflicts, including South Sudan, Burundi, the DRC, and Iraq, indirect deaths have represented up to 10 times the number of direct victims. Now, you'd be glad to know, for the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to spare you the minutiae of counting and classification. Instead, I want to challenge the meta-narrative of gradual pacification by examining the manifestations, drivers, and consequences of the contemporary return of barbarism in armed conflict and situations of generalized violence. While Pinker and others point to the vast majority of countries in the world that live in the zone of peace, the 20%, others are experiencing lethal civil conflict in which indiscriminate attacks on civilians, the annihilation of religious and ethnic minorities, and the starvation of populations are a regular part of the strategic repertoire of belligerents. This barbarism in the conduct of civil war, as I will suggest, is having a profound impact on the regime of international humanitarian law. Now, in so doing, I will acknowledge that contemporary challenges to that regulation are not just external to the regime. They're also internal to its principles and rules. IHL has always had within it an inherent tension between humanitarian considerations and the imperatives of military necessity, which has in some cases enabled practices deeply destructive for civilians and civilian infrastructure. It also has had a long-standing blind spot with respect to the regulation of war within states. But I will also stress that the culprits in the erosion of respect for IHL, the perpetrators of 21st century barbarism, are not just the nasty non-state armed groups, such as Islamic State. Nation states themselves, either directly or through their support for allies, are also contributing to the erosion of the international humanitarian order. And this suggests to me that the challenge to IHL may run deeper than situational questions of compliance or non-compliance. As some scholars have suggested, the number and the nature of violations of IHL today may signal not just a lack of conformity between actual and prescribed behavior, but a deeper rejection of the validity or binding quality of the obligations themselves. Now, in a final move, and I'll see if I have time, I want to step outside the confines of formal armed conflict, and this is part of my IOW project, to question how situations other than war challenge any meta-narrative of pacification. The 2015 report, The Global Burden of Armed Violence, shows that most contemporary lethal violence does not occur in zones of formal armed conflict. Indeed, the majority of states most affected by lethal violence are not at war, as lawyers would define it. Yet much of this violence is far from random. A narrow focus on formal armed conflict risks obscuring the high levels of security around the world in countries such as Guatemala, El Salvador, Venezuela, Mexico, and beyond. And it also obscures how it challenges both domestic and regional orders. But the emphasis on lethal violence in war does more than mislead us about the scale and intensity of violence in our world today. As Keith Krause has suggested, it also narrows our normative gaze in ways that diminish responsibility and accountability. An empirical focus on war, as defined by law or political science, limits the scope of debate on moral and legal responsibility to forms of violence that are covered by just war doctrine, or IHL, but leave largely unexplored the morally equivalent responsibility that governments should face for other forms of violence and harm that are committed in their name. So I want to structure my lecture around what I call pockets of barbarism through 3 vignettes. And the first of these relates to what for many is the most visible form of contemporary barbarism, the crimes perpetrated by what former British Prime Minister David Cameron called the medieval monsters, namely Islamic State. Now, in the summer of 2014, Daesh waged a violent campaign against civilian populations in Nineveh province in northern Iraq, home to many of the country's ethnic and religious minorities. As Daesh advanced on cities, towns, and villages, it systematically wiped out centuries-old communities and traditions, deliberately destroying shrines, temples, and churches, forcing residents to convert to Islam at gunpoint, executing community and religious leaders in public squares, kidnapping women and subjecting them to sexual enslavement, and coercing young boys to fight. While the exact number of dead is still unknown, 800,000 people were forcibly displaced. Now, the wrath of IS was particularly focused on the Yazidi community, a Kurdish-speaking minority whose religion derives from ancient Persian faith and contains elements of both Christianity and Islam. IS described the Yazidi as devil worshippers and claimed that their religion had to be eradicated. Unlike other Christian and Jewish minorities who were given the option of paying a tax to avoid conversion or death, the Yazidi were made the object of an explicit episode of ethnic cleansing. During the first week of August, 40,000 Yazidis who managed to leave their homes before the onslaught became trapped along a craggy ridge on the top of Mount Sinjar, encircled by IS. United Nations human rights officials, whom I spoke to, recalled desperate phone calls from stranded Yazidi mothers, threatening to kill themselves and their daughters if the international community failed to come to their rescue. Then U.S. President Barack Obama eventually authorized protective airstrikes on August 7th, claiming in a televised address that he would not allow a genocidal massacre on his watch. And so Syrian Kurdish forces, supported by U.S. air power, established an evacuation route. But many died on the mountain, and the majority who escaped faced continued upheaval and insecurity. Nadia Murad, a former captive of IS and later an activist for the Yazidi, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize this past October for her efforts to seek justice for the crimes committed. Now, the systematic and brutal violence perpetrated by IS against the Yazidi, along with other minorities in Iraq and Syria, is a far cry from the meta-narrative of pacification or the progressive picture of the Middle East painted by so many commentators in the winter of 2011 during the early stages of the so-called Arab Spring. The domino effect of popular uprisings in Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, and then Syria, which drew millions into mass action for the first time, seemed to confirm the Middle East as the next successful site of Francis Fukuyama's predictions about the spread of liberal democracy. Almost a decade on, however, we know that the democratic surge inspired by this civil resistance has reversed, leading to not only the continuation of previous patterns of corruption and the reinstallation of new versions of autocracy, but also to a new wave of government crackdowns, civil war, and bloody sectarian violence. The depths of the turmoil and the ease with which terrorist organizations have taken advantage of the power vacuum has led some to nostalgically wish for the good old days of the Middle East's authoritarian order. And indeed, reading reports, as I did yesterday, of what life is like for the critics of the Sisi regime in Egypt, it's obvious that authoritarianism has returned in a new and improved form. Others, however, see this current period of instability as proof of the no pain, no gain thesis, namely that political transition is a bumpy affair with inevitable setbacks. The political scientist Sherry Berman argues that many revolutions, including those in France and in Russia, have had a vicious undertow, plunging their societies into waves of violence and counter-violence. So according to this view, the fault lies not in the democratic model or in the population's immaturity and inability to embrace it. Rather, it can be found in the previous system's pathologies and divisive strategies of rule and its tendency to leave behind pent-up distrust and animosity. Even failed democratic experiments, Berman writes, are usually critical positive stages in the political development of countries. Now, there are at least three problems, with this longue durée view of political development, and one might say the meta-narrative of pacification. The first is it assumes that violent upheaval, euphemistically described as a setback, is serving one greater purpose, the eventual triumph of liberal democracy. In reality, however, the violence that we've seen enables and forecloses all kinds of dynamics that were not necessarily inevitable and whose trajectory is difficult to predict. So in Syria and Iraq, for example, it crowded out nonviolent forms of activism and motivated many ordinary people to align with extremist organizations out of concern for day-to-day survival. Second, the no pain, no gain thesis suggests that the particularly lethal sectarian violence seen in the Middle East was to a large extent preordained, as opposed to a phenomenon that was aided and abetted, not only by local actors, but by the policies and follies of the West as well. The U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, designed to contain the alleged threat of weapons of mass destruction, was initially declared a victory, but as we know, soon descended into armed insurgency and ultimately sectarian violence. The public inquiry initiated by the British government to identify lessons learned from Iraq not only concluded that the US and UK had chosen to intervene on the basis of flawed intelligence, but also presented a damning critique of inadequate post-war planning. What I found most interesting about the Chilcot inquiry was that he firmly rejected the argument that the potential for chaos in Iraq could only have been seen in hindsight. Many of the difficulties encountered after the coalition's successful military campaign, in his words, had been or could have been foreseen. And the third problem the macro-level perspective presents is that it obscures from our view both how formal armed conflict is related to a broader backdrop of political violence, as well as the mechanisms and processes through which what McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley have called everyday dynamics of contention can underpin and facilitate large-scale outbreaks of violence. This is also true of the discipline of international relations, which tends to begin its analysis when large-scale violence has already occurred. But this exclusive focus on war means we know little about how we get from such things as state repression or group violence to civil war, from Sidi Bouzid to Syria. Indeed, as Keith Krauss' analysis suggests, the macro perspective prevents us from seeing the way different forms of violence may be linked through processes that escalate and exacerbate conflict, and that may have broader impacts on state formation, state disintegration, and regional order. In particular, the macro perspective doesn't help us to understand what was arguably the greatest symptom and greatest beneficiary of the pushback against the protest movements, namely the Islamic State. The campaigns of IS, interestingly, were responsible for some of the spikes in the number of territorial conflicts recorded in 2015 and 2016, the highest since the tumultuous years in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. The escalating conflicts in which they were involved had highly destructive consequences, leading to violent spillover effects in other parts of the world, and the highest number of forcibly displaced persons ever recorded. Now, while IS is clearly now on the back foot, clinging to the last vestiges of territorial control, it has deeply shaken assumptions about the purpose and nature of political violence, and unleashed dynamics of war and counterterrorism that have altered the political trajectories of states in the Middle East and beyond. Much in the way that the Iraq War helped to create conditions for the emergence of IS's own brutal pursuit of a caliphate has changed forever relationships among and within communities, giving rise to waves of counterattacks against those accused of aiding their advance, and legitimizing lethal violence by the Iraqi and Syrian state. The widespread and systematic attacks directed against civilian populations by IS have been characterized by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights as acts that could constitute crimes against humanity. So this raises the question of whether and how the descent into barbarism can be reversed. With the signing of the additional protocols in the 1970s, non-state armed groups fighting in a civil war incurred obligations to comply with the Geneva Conventions, particularly so-called Common Article 3. Individual members of non-state armed groups can also be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court or other international tribunals for grave violations of IHL. But in practice, it's been extremely difficult to encourage non-state armed groups to comply with the laws of war or to apprehend their members for alleged crimes. An even more complicated question is whether non-state armed groups that actually control territory have obligations to protect populations under their remit beyond the negative obligation not to commit atrocity crimes. Thus far, the international community has been reluctant to suggest that they do, for fear that such a move would also entail recognizing armed groups as state-like entities with legitimate authority over a territory and a population. Now, the challenge to the international humanitarian order posed by non-state armed groups is even starker when we consider their proliferation. The ICRC study, The Roots of Restraint in War, notes that more non-state armed groups have emerged in the last 7 years than in the previous 70. Political scientists like Tanisha Fazal, who analyzes how non-state armed groups interact with international humanitarian law, suggests that the task of encouraging compliance may be less daunting than we might think. According to Fazal, secessionist groups seek international recognition and legitimacy and have future-oriented goals. They are thus more likely to comply with IHL, to garner support from the international community and achieve their political aims. But of course, this begs the question of how compliance works for non-state armed groups that are not legitimacy seekers and that are highly decentralized, making efforts to exert top-down control by their leaders more difficult. Indeed, in the case of IS, concerns about international legitimation are virtually non-existent. Far from trying to conceal or downplay their criminal acts, members of IS have glorified the horrors that they inflict on their captive populations. IS is therefore openly subversive of the regime of IHL and challenges its binding quality. It not only ignores the law, but actually tries to subvert it. One of the initial weaknesses in Western leaders' response to IS after 2010 was the failure to understand the nature and role of the religious ideology that underpins it. The theological justifications for its actions were treated as mere medieval disguises. In our liberal democratic model, where the principle of secularism has led to a tolerance of religious diversity or a retreat of religion into the private sphere, it was difficult to believe that religion could matter so profoundly, not just to a group's tactics, but to its core strategies. And so Western analysts and policymakers searched for the more concrete political motives that they thought must lurk underneath. The West eventually found those underlying objectives in earlier generations of al-Qaeda, when Osama bin Laden announced his goals of securing the U.S. withdrawal of its forces from Saudi Arabia and the end of support for dictatorships in Muslim lands. But the Islamic State, with its apocalyptic vision, seemed to put nothing remotely recognizable on the negotiating table. Part of the mystery of IS was its hybrid quality, both medieval and modern, both diffuse and territorial rooted. It operated through a set of autonomous and decentralized cells, but on the other hand, sought more state-like infrastructures, including a training center in Raqqa and a clear plan to build a territorial base. When it seized Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, its ambition to conquer territory and govern became more than just a metaphor. From a pulpit in the city's great mosque, the self-proclaimed leader of IS declared himself the next caliph, successor to Muhammad, and invited Muslims from around the world to come and pledge obedience. A stream of jihadists subsequently flowed. What distinguished the IS claim to territory, however, was that it crossed established boundaries. Unlike other terrorist groups, such as the IRA, the Basque separatists in Spain, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, which sought to carve out land from within an existing state through secession, IS's goals were more expansionist. It sought to radically alter the map of the region by eradicating 2 existing states and creating one unified caliphate. This approach to territory puts into question Fazal's hypothesis about the quest for legitimation, encouraging compliance with the laws of war. But of course, it also raises the issue of what will become of IS when it loses its last territorial base. It cannot continue its caliphate without authority over a piece of land. Take away its command of territory, and all those oaths of allegiance are no longer binding. The significance of the well-ordered caliphate goes beyond its status as a governing entity that offers protection or where Sharia law can be enforced. It's also what analyst Graham Wood described as a vehicle for salvation, as adherents to Islamic State believe that Muslims can't live a fully Islamic life, no matter how devout their practices, unless they pledge their allegiance to a caliph. So traveling to the territory of IS became part of an individual's spiritual redemption. Some of those who traveled to Syria, for example, between 2011 and 2016, had an explicitly political agenda, born out of the promise of the Arab Spring, the defeat of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime and the creation of a moderate and democratic government. So they sought to support the rebel opposition and groups such as the Free Syrian Army. Like many in the international brigades of the 1930s in the Spanish Civil War, their goal was the spread of democracy. But the more worrying majority of travelers were better described as foreign terrorist fighters, not foreign fighters, whose political agenda or cause was more difficult to locate. Instead, their primary motivation, as my colleague Olivier Waugh put it, is the fascination for a narrative, to join the fight to bring about the apocalyptic standoff between the followers of Muhammad and the infidel West. A final feature of the appeal of IS that's worth noting is that it was able to harness the anger that accompanied foreign and largely Western intervention in the Middle East. Far from being a throwback to the barbaric Middle Ages, IS was therefore a very modern creation. But while its origins lie in the specific context of the post-2003 invasion of Iraq, its spread in the Middle East also had much to do with the reversals of the Arab Spring. Two phenomena combined to create the ecosystem in which it flourished: the disillusionment that followed the failure to change autocratic regimes, and the fear and sectarian violence that insecure rulers across the region deliberately fostered to try to maintain their hold on power, particularly Bashar al-Assad. While throughout the civil war in his country, the president has tried to paint a simple picture, either support my regime or support the terrorists, in reality, he and other members of his regime have actively collaborated with members of IS and spared the organization from the aerial attacks to which the government has regularly subjected the Syrian population. In fact, while today's nation-states like to point the finger at non-state armed groups as the primary perpetrators of barbarism, today the greatest violators of IHL remain national governments. As former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon put it in his report for the first ever World Humanitarian Summit, flouting the most basic rules governing the conduct of war has become contagious, creating further risks to reinterpret and blur their application. When states disrespect or undermine IHL, including through expansive interpretation, other states and non-state actors regard this as an invitation to do the same. So let's turn to my second vignette. Although the civil war in Syria had been raging and metastasizing for years, it commenced one of its grimmest chapters in the summer of 2016, when the long stalemate between government and opposition forces was finally broken and Syrian government troops closed the rebels' last supply line into Aleppo with the help of Russian airstrikes. This produced one of the longest sieges in the history of modern warfare, despite a series of counteroffensive by the opposition to break the stranglehold, and by many accounts the bloodiest battles of an already vicious civil war. Roughly 31,000 people died during the siege, 1/10 of all casualties in the war up to 2016, through the combined effects of explosions, shelling, barrel bombs, and other aerial bombardment, field executions, and chemical attacks. While the UN's Commission of Inquiry for Syria continued to document instances of war crimes being committed, its February 2017 report analyzed one particularly shocking attack by Syrian government forces on an aid convoy in the Aleppo countryside, which killed more than a dozen aid workers and denied vital supplies to thousands of civilians in need. The commissioners condemned the attack, which included a grisly combination of helicopters loaded with barrel bombs, jet fighters, and the spraying of machine gun fire, and concluded that the incident was meticulously planned as part of a broader policy towards opposition-held areas of starve or surrender. Hospitals, schools, and marketplaces were also routinely hit, prompting the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Ra al-Hussein, to characterize the abuses in Aleppo as constituting crimes of historic proportions. Those who managed to survive faced high prices for scarce food, medicines, and fuels, and endured medieval-like living conditions. In December 2016, in the face of almost complete collapse of rebel forces, the Syrian government initiated a campaign that would ultimately result in its triumphant recapturing of the city. On the 13th of the month, a ceasefire was announced, and the evacuation of populations from opposition areas was organized and communicated. Yet, the plan unfolded in fits and starts, with 3 failed attempts, sending frightened residents back to their homes, and UN offices receiving credible reports of scores of civilians being killed by summary execution. In his last press conference as UN Secretary General on December 16th, Ban Ki-moon summed up this spectacle of 21st century barbarism by declaring that Aleppo is now a synonym for hell. The sordid episode of the Aleppo siege and evacuation all took place under the watchful eye of the UN Security Council. As the body designed with the primary responsibility for managing international peace and security, the Council faced intensifying criticism going back to 2011 for its failure to produce a robust response to international crimes that took place in Syria. Permanent members of the Council reverted to the old Cold War practice of vetoing resolutions. The reasons behind the breakdown in cooperation and mutual recrimination, which are broader than the Syrian crisis, can't be rehearsed by me now. They stem from a variety of factors and policies. But even when assessed against the low expectations that had been set by 5 years of unproductive bickering, the inability of the permanent members to mount an effective response to the siege and the violations of ISL was a colossal abdication of responsibility. Over the past 150 years, and in the last 3 decades in particular, governments worldwide have invested considerable effort and political capital into strengthening the international legal frameworks governing war, promoting the protection of civilians and the principle of distinction, ensuring unfettered access to humanitarian assistance, and establishing courts to address the most serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Yet while the normative pull of IHL has been celebrated, it's also crucial to recognize some of its internal or intrinsic features which enable high levels of suffering and destruction for civilians. A good place to start is with the recognition that modern IHL, as it developed in the 19th century, was focused on the casualties of combat, so vividly captured in Henri Dunant's account of Solferino. The first Geneva Convention in 1864 committed 12 European states to recognize the neutrality and immunity of ambulances in military hospitals and to take care of wounded and sick soldiers. It was only after World War I that modern humanitarianism elevated the plight of non-combatants, and it was only in the 1920s that the Red Cross and humanitarian organizations began to use the term civilians in order to distinguish this population from military personnel. In focusing on means to reduce civilian suffering, these organizations were drawing on an earlier body of national law, the American Labor Code of 1863, which had been created to regulate the conduct of unionists in the American Civil War, and which was later translated by European jurists for use in the Franco-Prussian War. But while Lieber prohibited unnecessary cruelty, wanton violence, rape, pillage, he also articulated what has become known as the principle of military necessity. In John Fabian Witt's magisterial study of the Code and its use in the Civil War, he demonstrates how the rationale of military necessity reflects another view about suffering in war, one that differs from the generic account forwarded by humanitarians like Dunant. For Lieber, not all suffering was the same. Some of it was in the service of a higher political goal, including, in historical perspective, the rescue of Western civilization from the barbarians. In short, war could in some cases work to ultimately reduce suffering. This was a very particular account of the relationship between war's ends and means, and one that finds echoes in some of the conflict-generated humanitarian crises of the 21st century. The philosophy was not, in John Fabian Witt's words, a one-size-fits-all reduction of suffering, but rather the need for a series of contextual judgments about what level and mode of violence was justified at different points in a particular context. If military necessity warranted, armies could, for example, force civilians to suffer the effects of siege warfare and bombard historical monuments or institutions of culture. We know that variations on this logic were evident in key episodes during the Second World War. So the two views of suffering in war, that it is to be minimized at all cost, or that it's to be balanced against the ultimate aims of war, both find expression in the Geneva Conventions. Our contemporary laws of war attempt to strike a balance between military necessity and humanitarian considerations, wherever and whenever they collide. On the one hand, it's true that the principle of distinction, which requires parties to a conflict to at all times distinguish between combatants and civilians, and to direct attacks only at combatants, has been codified in additional protocols 1 and 2. On the other hand, Lieber's idea of military necessity is also built into the Geneva Conventions as part of the legal justification for particular attacks on legitimate military targets, even if such attacks have adverse consequences for civilians. The delicate balance that modern IHL represents requires vigilance on the part of national armed forces and the various organizations that try to hold them to account for their conduct in war. Without it, the mutual interest that warring parties have in respecting the laws of rightful conduct in war, laws that apply to both sides, quickly erodes. It's then only a small step back down the ladder into unregulated killing. And yet we have seen over recent years a period in which the lethality of civil conflict for civilians has been severe. Warring parties have driven a bulldozer through any opening within IHL that might provide it with an opportunity to roll back their obligations to protect civilians. This includes, for example, the provision that the state in which conflict is occurring must consent to the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And in 2014, the UN Security Council had to take the unprecedented step of passing a resolution to authorize the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Explosive weapons are routinely used in densely populated areas, making the principle of distinction virtually impossible to honor. Hospitals and schools have been directly targeted, not as part of the fog of war, but as a conscious choice of warring sides. The failure to respect or ensure respect for IHL is not only the practice of the ruthless conductors of armed conflict, like Bashar al-Assad, but also liberal democracies when they are at war. The practice of U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Afghanistan during the first term of the Obama presidency drew on the questionable assumption that all fighting-aged males in a certain vicinity were combatants, unless there was specific evidence to the contrary. This permissive approach to defining targets not only ran against the spirit of the additional protocol, but also challenged the core normative advance made during the 20th century to protect civilians. And when liberal democracies are not directly challenging core norms themselves, they are permitting, or even worse, actively assisting others to do so. In a third of today's civil wars, third-party actors from the outside are supporting one or more of the parties to the conflict. Some have gone so far as to use force in support of entities responsible for widespread and systematic violations that could constitute atrocity crimes. Think of Russia and the Syrian regime. Others have either supplied the weapons to commit these crimes, turned a blind eye to their trade and transportation, or used their political influence to shield perpetrators. For example, far too little has been done to ensure full respect for IHL in the ongoing conflict in Yemen, despite the ties that exist between the parties to the conflict and important regional and global powers such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Some of these countries are state parties to the Arms Trade Treaty, an agreement that explicitly seeks to control arms flows to actors that may use them in ways that breach IHL. All of these cases of the violations of the laws of war are creating a gap between the public's knowledge and expectation of IHL, which is actually at an all-time high, and the reality of compliance with the law in today's conflict. As the ICRC's legal advisor, Helen Durham, has warned, we must not allow this gap to develop into a vicious cycle where not respecting the law becomes the new normal. The governments of Western liberal democracies were at the forefront of efforts to disseminate IHL and encourage ratification of the relevant treaties. And the armed forces of Western states have invested extensively in training other national militaries on how to comply. This by no means suggests that Western states have consistently complied with IHL. Their violations of the laws of war, whether in Algeria or Vietnam, have been legendary. But there's strong evidence confirming that liberal democratic states have gone the furthest in actually implementing the legal commitments they signed on to. Nonetheless, as I've suggested, we find ourselves today in a situation where Western states either actively support allies engaged in alleged war crimes or themselves succumb to the arguments of military necessity. In other cases, Western states avoid engaging with the formalities of war altogether, such as declarations of war, so as to create ambiguity regarding their legal obligations. In her recent book, Wars of Law, Tanisha Fazal suggests that part of the contemporary challenge of compliance stems from an increasing gap between the lawmakers and the law takers. Whereas in the earlier period of the making of international humanitarian law, militaries were the lead participants. Today, it's lawyers and NGOs who negotiate treaties that regulate armed conflict. This creates, she would argue, a misalignment of incentives, given that the preferences and strategic considerations of the military are not sufficiently considered. While there may be some merit to this argument, I believe the current erosion of respect for IHL, witnessed by the continued use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, and other developments such as the weakening of the taboo on the use of chemical weapons, goes beyond situational compliance or non-compliance. As Ian Clark and Chris Reyes-Smith have suggested, the real problem with IHL is neither compliance nor effectiveness, but rather the fact that the actions of both non-state actors such as IS and key states such as the US and Russia have edged toward a tipping point when violations have cumulatively imposed legitimacy costs on the regime itself. While many legal analysts focus on how the phenomenon of asymmetric warfare is exploiting existing ambiguity in the laws of war and eroding the role of reciprocity in inducing compliance, these authors point to a deeper crisis in the laws of war. Not only are non-state forces acting outside the regime, rejecting IHL, but also some prominent state actors are subverting it from within, either by attempts at revision or through denial of its applicability. The regime is no longer supported wholeheartedly even by the old warriors, they write, rather than just being ignored by the new. The key question that emerges then is whether IHL will endure this critical juncture, which is akin to the challenge to IHL posed by the Second World War and the national liberation wars of the 1960s and 70s. Clark and Reyes-Smith believe the challenge to IHL today is qualitatively different from previous challenges because there's been a shift in the distribution of reputational costs away from non-compliant actors towards the regime of IHL. This shift reflects, in their view, a more fundamental problem, that actors, both state and non-state, hold radically different conceptions of the nature and purpose of violence, the theme of your lecture series. The problem is no longer not simply one of managing or enforcing compliance with a regime whose institutional characteristics are widely understood and diffused, but instead to try to forge some kind of new social bargain that accounts for changes in ideas about legitimate and illegitimate recourses to force. But until such a social bargain can be struck, and I have my doubts, the advance of pacification looks very uncertain. So let me move to my final strand of argumentation, which I want to pursue tonight, which problematizes the pacification meta-narrative from another angle and focuses on the growing phenomenon of what we might call, following Keith Krause, non-war violence. In his article From Armed Conflict to Political Violence, he sets out 4 empirical observations that are worth summarizing for you here. First, most lethal violence today doesn't occur in conflict zones. Second, the majority of states most affected by lethal violence are not at war. Third, the levels of lethal violence in some non-conflict settings are higher than in war zones. And finally, much of this violence is not random but organized. So according to the global burden of armed violence, while on average just over 500,000 people now die annually in violent circumstances, just 15% of those die in formal conflict settings. The remainder die in non-war settings, and about 5% die as a result of the violence by the state or its agents. Consider as illustration my final vignette. In the early hours of June 30th, 2014, in a warehouse in Tayatlaya, a community west of Mexico City, a 20-year-old kidnapping victim heard gunfire and cries of "Mexican army, surrender." For the previous 9 days, she had been held captive by armed men who now faced the Mexican armed forces. According to 2 of the victims, their abductors quickly surrendered to army forces, hands over their heads. Yet, as recounted by 3 surviving women, 22 individuals, 3 of whom were minors, were killed by the army that day after their surrender. A different story was told by Mexico's defense ministry, which issued a press release on the day of the incident, claiming that the killings had been in response to an attack and were part of a sustained firefight. The governor of the state of Mexico saluted the army for rescuing victims of kidnapping and killing 22 members of organized crime in self-defense. Questions began to emerge, however, when the Associated Press found that evidence at the site failed to match the army account of a clash with drug suspects. There was little sign of a long gun battle. Instead, the walls showed a repeated pattern of 1 or 2 closely placed bullet holes surrounded by spattered blood, giving the appearance that some of those killed had been standing against a wall. The government's Human Rights Commission later determined that 12 to 15 people had been executed at the warehouse. Its documentation also indicates that the victims' bodies were moved from their original positions and locations and were arranged with planted weapons. Yet state and federal prosecutors actively resisted any attempt at investigating strong leads against the army. This entailed subjecting the surviving victims to further atrocities. When the 20-year-old survivor told state investigators what she had seen, she said they tortured her through severe beatings, plunging her head into a toilet bowl and threatening to rape her. She was then sent to Mexico City, where investigators in the organized crime unit pressed her, in the absence of a lawyer, to sign a statement affirming their version of events. After the story fabricated by the army unraveled, new evidence emerged strongly suggesting that this massacre was not an aberration, but an outgrowth of policy. 1 year after the incident, in July 2015, a group which represents the victims announced that it had obtained a copy of standing written orders for military operations in the area in 2 documents from 2014. The orders specified that actions to reduce violence should be planned and executed in the dark hours, directed at specific targets. Although it contained no guidance on how soldiers should differentiate between civilians and criminals. The order further instructs soldiers to take down any suspects. The ongoing violence in Mexico, both among drug cartels and between government armed forces and the cartels, is a stark illustration of how lethal situations other than war can be. Such situations create particular challenges for international actors, both governmental and non-governmental, who seek to protect populations from harm, not least because they create ambiguity in the status of particular individuals, encounter pushback through calls for non-intervention, and engender debates about relevant legal frameworks and the obligations of states and other actors. Finally, as I suggested through my vignette, these situations clearly enable the militarization of public security, which constitutes an important caveat to the meta-narrative of pacification. But to what extent can we think of this violence as organized, as opposed to random and interpersonal? Unfortunately, and perhaps this is a challenge for your lecture series, we have very little systematic or comparative data on the scope and nature of non-war violence. Above all, we lack common definitions of what constitutes communal violence, criminal violence, or political violence. And the tendency in the field of criminology to label all non-conflict deaths as homicides also makes it difficult to determine which killings are linked to broader dynamics. Violence in many of the war settings in Central and South America have large-scale social-political consequences. Mexico, when looked at from the outside, appears to be a key democratic state in the Americas, a member of a trilateral agreement with the United States and Canada, and a promoter of human rights-related agendas at the UN and beyond. Surely, it's part of the wave of progressive development and pacification. But contrast this with the picture painted by the Geneva Academy, which in 2017 showed that in absolute numbers, the total number of fatalities linked to the decade-long war on drugs was 100,000, easily exceeding the political science measure, 1,000 battle deaths annually, for determining the existence of an armed conflict. The high intensity of the violence led the International Institute of Strategic Studies to identify Mexico as the second most violent country in the world in 2016, below Syria, but above both Iraq and Afghanistan. But how should we classify violence in Mexico from a legal point of view? The most widely recognized legal definition of a non-international armed conflict appears in the Tadic decision of the ICTY, in which the tribunal states that an armed conflict exists whenever there's a resort to armed force between states or protracted armed violence between government authorities and organized armed groups, or between such groups within a state. This definition, along with subsequent jurisprudence of the tribunal, identifies 2 broad criteria of existence: the degree of organization of armed groups and the intensity of the violence. What's interesting, of course, about the legal definition is that they avoid analysis of motivations for violence. The extent to which these 2 criteria can be found in Mexico varies widely. Some are clearly present and some are clearly absent. And because I want to wrap up, I don't want to take you through piece by piece how we should evaluate it. But 3 points are quickly worth highlighting in counter to the argument that we should consider it an armed conflict. First, Mexican cartels arguably lack the form of organization necessary to carry out sustained military operations, and to be able to comply with IHL. Mexican violence is best described, according to Neil Sanchez, not as macro violence at the strategic level, the confrontation of two or more well-organized and disciplined military structures in a theater of military operations, but rather as multiple incidents of micro-violence at a local level. Furthermore, while the number of Mexican soldiers deployed is certainly impressive, they have been tasked exclusively with law enforcement operations, not with military operations. The powers given to the military and Navy include those to arrest traffickers, set up checkpoints, destroy poppy and marijuana fields, and interdict drug shipments, but not to attack enemy combatants. In addition, it could be argued that criminal gangs don't challenge directly the Mexican armed forces over the right to control and govern territory. They prefer instead to coexist peacefully and follow cooptation and bribing tactics, not direct aggression. Drug cartels seek to subvert, not defeat, the Mexican state. Finally, and perhaps most tellingly, despite the dramatic militarization of public security and counter-narcotics operations, international humanitarian law is rarely, if ever, invoked by either military officers or civil society organizations, and thus has played virtually no role in discussions about regulating the use of force in the context of public militarization. This is the finding of two Mexican-based researchers who form part of my project on the individualization of war. The standard case in favor of classifying the violence in Mexico as a non-international armed conflict is as follows. Given the serious threat posed by drug cartels to whole populations, the Mexican government should recognize that a conflict exists and allow itself the particular privileges and justifications for the use of force that belong to the laws of war. Innocent lives could be saved if the Mexican military undertook the appropriate level of defensive force against the cartels as outlined by the laws of war. A parallel case could also be made on humanitarian grounds. Once a determination of a conflict is made, the protection clauses of Common Article 3 and other norms of customary IHL would come into effect, and more international attention would be paid to the way force is used in Mexico, and there could be more pressure for accountability for war crimes committed in Mexican territory. But remarkably, neither of these arguments and corresponding lines of policy has emerged in public debates in Mexico. In contrast to the cases of Colombia and Peru, where military officers have invoked the laws of war and NGOs have mobilized humanitarian principles, this has not occurred in the case of Mexico. The ICRC has refrained from issuing any public statements as to the legal nature of Mexican violence, even though it's been actively involved in the country since it opened its office in 2006. Instead, the relevant normative and legal framework for the use of force in Mexico has been international human rights law, in at least two senses. First, domestic NGOs critical of militarization have articulated their denunciations in the language of human rights law. And second, military rules of engagement and guidelines on the use of force refer only to human rights standards. At the same time, however, impunity for the excessive use of force abounds. Civil society organizations regularly declare that the Mexican armed forces lack systematic training in law enforcement. Oversight of military operations is extremely weak, and accountability for grave violations lacking. Indeed, it's notable that in 2016, the remaining charges against Army officers in the case of My Vignette were dropped, meaning there was no accountability for unlawful killing. So this raises questions about the degree to which human rights standards can really serve to constrain the militarization of public security, about the prospects of accountability through international criminal law, and more broadly, about the capacity to regulate force in situations that cannot be accurately characterized as either war or peace. More broadly, it brings us back to two observations that I made at the outset of my remarks tonight. The first is that a narrow focus on formal armed conflict limits the scope of debate on moral and legal responsibility to forms of violence covered by international humanitarian law, but underemphasizes the morally equivalent responsibility that governments should face for other forms of violence and harm committed in their name. The second is the need for those who have previously focused on macro-level studies of war to examine the mechanisms and processes through which state repression or everyday dynamics of contention can underpin and facilitate large-scale outbreaks of violence that may have broader impacts on state formation, state disintegration, and regional order. While my discussion has focused on Mexico, where violence is drug-related, the current crisis in Venezuela is a clearer case of how political violence can escalate and how we lack adequate frameworks to push for responsibility and accountability. Those of you who have read the May 2018 report of the General Secretary of the Organization of American States and the panel of independent experts will see that there are indeed reasonable grounds that satisfy the standard of proof required by Article 53 of the Rome Statute for considering that acts to which the population of Venezuela have been subject, at least back to February 2014, constitute crimes against humanity. The report makes shocking and grim reading, documenting a pattern of widespread and systematic attacks against the opposition. As actors at the national, regional, and international level currently struggle to contain a humanitarian crisis, but also to prevent the weakening legitimacy of the Maduro government from facilitating the resort to more lethal violence, it's worth remembering that broad claims about linear processes of democratization or pacification, or indeed the end of history, overlook how even low-level but sustained violence can have long-term systematic and structural consequences. In short, the so-called zone of peace is never really hermetically sealed. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to your questions.